the U.S. could be defenseless against Chinese hypersonic weapons. Hong Kongers take to the street, and U.S. satellite companies are helping China's military and police. This is China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. This week's China News headlines. China's hypersonic weapons are posing a serious threat to the United States. That's according to a meeting this week of the American Foreign Policy Council. China's hypersonic missiles will be capable of delivering conventional and nuclear warheads anywhere on the globe with a flight time measured in mere minutes. Good. I hate waiting for anything. Hypersonic weapons, according to a professor of aerospace engineering at Michigan University, are rocket-boosted to high altitude and may be launched from land, sea, or air. They fly far faster than any other weapons, more than 3,000 miles per hour and potentially up to 10,000 miles per hour, which makes them difficult to identify, avoid, or shoot down. And that might mean they could get through U.S. defense systems. According to one of the speakers at the American Foreign Policy Council, these newly developed hypersonic missiles can potentially penetrate U.S. ballistic missile defenses and possibly target and destroy early warning radars and/or aircraft carriers in the event of a future conflict. This is a big problem, not just for America, but for Taiwan. Not that Taiwan needed more problems. A senior defense official told reporters at the Pentagon earlier this year that as China's hypersonic weapons technology improves, it might make Beijing more willing to take risks it wouldn't have before. They are getting to a point where the PLA leadership may actually tell Xi Jinping that they are confident in their abilities. And I would just like to remind any of the PLA leadership watching that I've always been a big fan of Xi Jinping. Ask anyone. Back me up on this one, guys. You might remember that the Chinese Communist Party has been a little upset with the Canadian government since last December. That's when Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei, was arrested in Canada. The U.S. had requested Canadian authorities arrest and extradite her because she's suspected of violating U.S. sanctions on Iran. And even though China asked Canada very nicely to ignore the rule of law and let Meng go, that has not happened yet. And now, a second Canadian has been sentenced to death in China. This Canadian was allegedly dealing drugs in China, just like the first one sentenced to death earlier this year. What a coincidence. These drug-dealing Canadians, eh? I should know. I'm addicted to maple syrup. Anyway, Canada is saying the Chinese Communist Party is arbitrarily applying the death sentence, to which they replied Canada totally has double standards. Which, considering Canada abolished the death penalty in the 1970s, I'm not quite sure what they mean. In addition to the two Canadians sentenced to death, two other Canadian citizens, former diplomat Michael Kovrig and businessman Michael Spavor, are also being held by China and face accusations of harming national security. And if they're watching the news, I'm sure they're very worried right now. I'm just kidding. They don't show that kind of news inside China. A former CIA agent who allegedly conspired with the Chinese Communist Party is expected to plead guilty. He's being charged with trying to give secret information to China, but for some background, this was happening at the same time as the CIA's network inside China was being exposed. Agents were arrested or killed. So I don't imagine the CIA is too happy with the guy. And the CIA are not the friendliest of people under the best of circumstances. Though to be clear, Li was not charged with being the mole who brought down the CIA network in China. The cause of that is still unknown, though Li is a suspect. Speaking of the CIA, spies! Spies everywhere! That's the message Chinese authorities have for the good people of Beijing. And a new directive has asked the public to get involved in rooting them out. Because asking the public to root out spies definitely won't result in baseless accusations. It's not like there's a history of that kind of thing in communist China. Let me spin you a little yarn about the ongoing U.S.-China trade talks. The U.S. might be putting duties of up to 460% on Chinese yarn. Okay, I mainly wanted to make that pun. Look, I spend all my days researching incredibly depressing things. Just give this to me. 3 Chinese banks may have violated U.S. sanctions on North Korea, and a U.S. judge wants their records. The 3 banks are accused of funneling over $100 million into North Korea. China is one of North Korea's only real allies. Well, China and Russia. Okay, China, Russia, and Dennis Rodman. And they're the only thing keeping the economy afloat. Like a healthy layer of fat keeps the dear leader afloat in a tub of water. The Chinese Communist Party has been really trampling on Hong Kong's freedom, and Taiwan is calling out the Hong Kong government for going along with it. Hong Kong denied entry to 68 Taiwanese Falun Gong practitioners who wanted to join a parade being held in the city to expose the persecution of Falun Gong in mainland China. Such delicious irony. If I didn't know better, I would say the Chinese Communist Party isn't honoring the one country, two systems policy. I don't want to jump to any conclusions, though. That really wouldn't be fair. And I'm afraid I have some bad news. It's going to be harder for all of us to bring home the bacon. The price of pork is expected to jump because of the ongoing swine flu in China. One industry expert told CNBC, "If I really like bacon, I'd be kind of stocking up." But don't run out and buy bacon yet, because I'll be right back with a story about massive protests in Hong Kong. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Umbrellas are once again in the streets of Hong Kong. Not because of foul weather, more like foul laws that rain down on freedom and wash away democratic institutions. The Hong Kong government has proposed amendments to Hong Kong's extradition laws. If passed, people in Hong Kong could be extradited to mainland China to face trial for things that are illegal in China. So Hong Kongers did what they're so good at. They protested en masse. 130,000 people. Clearly, no one wants to be extradited to mainland China.
The way they have organized this law, as soon as they want to extradite you, it's hopeless. The scariest thing is that in the mainland, they can detain you via executive order. No crime is needed.
It's scary because China has very different laws than Hong Kong. Laws that say criticizing the Communist Party or practicing religion are punishable by long prison sentences. And even if they don't have a law for the thing you did, don't worry, they can make one up. Back in 1997, the UK had to give Hong Kong to the People's Republic of China. But they were concerned that the Chinese regime would immediately take away Hong Kong's freedom. So the British had the Chinese government sign the Sino-British Joint Declaration, where China promised not to change Hong Kong's laws for at least 50 years. Only after 50 years could the Chinese regime take away Hong Kong's freedom. But it's been only 22 years, and already the Chinese regime is like, what Sino-British Joint Declaration? Ha ha, suckers! But taking away Hong Kong's freedom has been done little by little, step by step. Mostly by the Chinese regime gradually influencing the Hong Kong government, which is made up of an unusual combination of elected officials and business groups, often with mainland ties. And then, from within Hong Kong's government, the Chinese regime uses the law to undermine freedoms. So it's all done legally. This became apparent in 2003, when the Hong Kong government proposed Article 23, an anti-subversion law. It would have allowed Hong Kong authorities to charge citizens with treason or subversion for things like saying Hong Kong should be independent from mainland China. Article 23 would have also allowed police to search people's homes, seize property, and detain people without a warrant as long as they suspected someone of treason or subversion, even for so-called crimes like handing out anti-Communist Party pamphlets. I mean, just look at this man handing out a flyer on how the Communist Party persecutes Falun Gong. Information is very dangerous. The good news is 500,000 Hong Kong residents looked at Article 23 and said, nope. And they got the government to ultimately back down and not pass it. That was 2003. Then in 2014, the Hong Kong government said they would allow people to vote for their chief executive, which is like a governor, but only from among candidates that the Chinese Communist Party pre-approved. And once again, the people of Hong Kong looked at this encroachment on their freedom and said, nope. That's how the 2014 umbrella movement began, where thousands of people occupied major streets in Hong Kong in protest for 79 days. But after that, the Chinese Communist Party got more clever. they probably had a hand in getting democratically elected pro-democracy legislators disqualified from parliament. And they pressured Hong Kong to go after people for protesting in the umbrella movement. Just last week, a Hong Kong court sentenced 9 leaders to prison, some of them for as long as 16 months. Their crime? Creating a public nuisance. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Or the bamboo that broke the panda's back. Or something. Anyway, this past Sunday, April 28th, 130,000 Hong Kongers protested the latest encroachment, the new extradition rules. Hong Kong already has extradition treaties with 20 countries, but they're free countries, like the US and the UK. But under the proposed changes, the Hong Kong chief executive would have the right to order the extradition of wanted offenders to China, Macau, and Taiwan. But don't worry, Hong Kong promises they're totally not going to use it against dissidents. The Hong Kong government justified the swift introduction of the changes by saying they're needed so a young Hong Kong man suspected of murdering his girlfriend in Taiwan can be extradited to face charges there. Right. For that one case involving Taiwan, it's necessary to allow extraditions to mainland China now, too. Why not just have a bilateral extradition treaty between Hong Kong and Taiwan? Well, because the Communist Party considers Taiwan part of China. So I don't think they'd be too happy if the Hong Kong government had a deal with Taiwan it didn't have with mainland China. They're the same country after all. So the excuse is obviously flimsy. But don't worry, you can trust the government. They won't abuse the law. Now to all those people who say, Chris Chappell, you're exaggerating. The law only applies to serious crimes, not dissidents. Well, you're technically right. It only applies to crimes that, if the conduct had occurred in Hong Kong, would constitute an offense, punishable in Hong Kong with imprisonment for more than 3 years. But remember, Hong Kong just jailed a bunch of democracy activists to 16 months in prison for the crime of creating a public nuisance. So there's already a trend away from Hong Kong's traditional British-style freedoms. But to be fair, this current round of changes to the extradition law is not at the level of allowing mainland Chinese authorities to just go into Hong Kong and grab any activists they want. But it is very likely step one in a larger plan. A plan to make Hong Kong's legal system look a lot more like the legal system in the rest of China. It's also possible dissidents aren't the main target of the extradition law. They might just be the icing on the cake. Chinese leader Xi Jinping is in a life-or-death power struggle with a rival faction in the Chinese Communist Party, made up of officials and business people tied to former Chinese leader and retired battletoad Jiang Zemin. Since everyone's corrupt in the Communist Party, Xi Jinping has been using what he calls an anti-corruption campaign to go after them. Since Xi started the push in 2012, authorities have investigated more than 2.7 million officials and punished more than 1.5 million people. The problem is, many of Xi Jinping's rivals have fled with their ill-gotten gains to Hong Kong, like a jar of honey just out of reach. In fact, it's widely believed Jiang's political faction still controls Hong Kong. The new extradition law could help Xi purge his rivals in Hong Kong, so he'd have greater control. Xi Jinping's got Jiang under close watch. In this scenario, Piglet is obviously me. So it could be part of the reason why this protest united both democracy activists and business people to say no to the extradition proposal. Notice the sign says "No China extradition." No one seems to be concerned about Taiwan extradition. And that reflects the larger problem. Normally, extradition only happens between countries that have a comparable legal system, allowing fair trials and allowing the accused access to a lawyer. So it makes sense to extradite people from Hong Kong to the UK or the US or even Taiwan. Not that I'm saying Taiwan is a country. But mainland China? People in mainland China sometimes don't even get a trial. They just sit in prison, like this Chinese journalist. Or are denied access to a lawyer, like this Australian writer. Or, if you're like this elderly Falun Gong practitioner, face trial, but it lasts only 20 minutes and you're not allowed to defend yourself. Her crime, by the way, was distributing flyers exposing how the Communist Party persecutes Falun Gong. Tragic irony. So anyway, Hong Kong's new extradition rules are just one small step towards bringing Hong Kong's legal system closer to mainland China. But the Hong Kong government wants to make sure you don't worry about it. It's really just to make sure that a suspected murderer faces trial in Taiwan. But Hong Kongers over the weekend still said, nope. And now they want Hong Kong's chief executive to step down over it. For them, that's step one. And after the break, turns out the US is playing a big part in the Chinese military and police. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Boy, I was depressed a few weeks ago when I found out Microsoft has been working with Chinese military universities to create artificial intelligence technology that the Chinese regime may be using to repress its citizens. Then I found out Google was doing pretty much the same thing. And I was like, okay, now I'm really depressed. And then the episode I made about that was demonetized by YouTube, which is owned by Google. And that was when I hit rock bottom. At least that's what I thought. But it turns out I had discovered a rock bottomless pit. Because guess what? It gets so much worse. Have you ever taken the time to think about how Chinese authorities communicate with their military and police about things like who to repress next? Okay, let's be honest, you're not thinking about how Chinese authorities communicate. You're probably spending more time wondering about if you should get fries on the side with that burger. Let me help you. The answer is get a side of pizza, then get fries on top of that. But to operate a system of mass surveillance with AI facial recognition and real-time GPS mapping, that requires transmitting a lot of data. And the best way to transmit data to and from remote locations is a satellite. But when it comes to satellite technology, Chinese satellites are way behind. See, the China Academy of Space Technology satellite can only achieve speeds of 20 gigabytes per second. But an American-made SSL satellite can transmit 220 gigabytes a second, and a Boeing satellite can reach 260 gigabytes a second. USA #1. And China's complex surveillance systems just need those faster speeds. And the solution is simple. They just use the American satellites. But you say, is that even legal? Well, it's not legal for US companies to sell satellites to China. But here's the thing. American satellite companies like Boeing and SSL love money. And China has a lot of money. And when lots of money is involved, there's always a loophole. And this Wall Street Journal report uncovered it. It shows the horrifying way China exploits US satellites to strengthen its police and military power. You know those fake islands China built in the South China Sea? The ones that now have military bases and missile launchers on them? They're getting internet thanks to a fleet of US-made satellites. The mass surveillance driving a brutal crackdown of ethnic Uyghur Muslims in China's Xinjiang? Thanks to more US satellites. Even the broadcast of state-run media propaganda is being carried on US-made satellites. In fact, a new satellite being built by Boeing could even help the Chinese regime replace the US-made GPS system. And it could also improve the People's Liberation Army's missile guidance systems. Now again, that seems like it should be totally against the law for US companies to sell satellites to China for all that stuff, right? And again, it is. But that's where the loophole comes in. Once the satellite is in space, there are no regulations on how the bandwidth of that satellite is used. And that has allowed China to essentially rent the capacity of US-built satellites it wouldn't be allowed to buy. Why own when you can rent? Especially when owning is illegal. Don't worry, because all of the companies mentioned in the Wall Street Journal article, Boeing, SSL, and the Carlyle Group, said they absolutely comply with all US laws. And they do. Technically. See, China doesn't own the satellites. They just own a big share in the company that owns the satellites. and then China rents bandwidth from those satellites. Here's how it works. There's a company called Asia Satellite Telecommunications Company, aka AsiaSat, and it's based in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong isn't China. Well, it is, but apparently not the part of China that's affected by US export controls. That was clever. So the Hong Kong company, AsiaSat, buys satellites from a US company, like Boeing or SSL. Now that order has to be approved by the US government to make sure no one's violating US laws on satellite export. And to help the US government understand how everything is totally legit, the Carlyle Group, one of the US's biggest private equity firms that owns a big chunk of AsiaSat, they send a compliance report to the US government. And the US government reads that report and says, oh, AsiaSat is a Hong Kong company, that's okay, and they approve the deal. But here's the twist. Another big chunk of AsiaSat is owned by the CITIC Group, which is owned by the Chinese government. Is that a problem? Well, I'm sure if it was, the managing director of the Carlyle Group, who also happens to be the chairman of AsiaSat, would have said something to the US government to blow up that incredibly lucrative deal. So Chinese state-owned CITIC then goes on to sell bandwidth from those American-made satellites to Chinese entities. For example, state-run propaganda broadcasters, soldiers in the South China Sea, or police in Xinjiang. Now obviously, Boeing or SSL, even AsiaSat, claim they never specifically intended for their technology to be used by China's Ministry of Public Security and the police, which I believe. Even though China's Ministry of Public Security has specifically said that's how they were using it. I mean, how could these poor US companies and AsiaSat executives know that a major owner of AsiaSat was a conglomerate owned by the Chinese government that had specifically bragged about how AsiaSat's satellites helped ensure communications for authorities as they quelled anti-government protests and riots in Tibet and Xinjiang? And how could they know that their data feeds, which provide internet coverage to the South China Sea, would be used to provide internet coverage to the South China Sea, where China is building all those military bases? Look, that stuff's complicated. It's not like rocket science. A spokesperson for the Carlyle Group told the Wall Street Journal that AsiaSat, because of privacy issues, doesn't monitor or regulate the content that flows through it. So obviously there's no way anyone at AsiaSat could have known what the Chinese military was up to. Of course, AsiaSat does draw the line somewhere. For instance, all that stuff I mentioned about the Chinese military and police, that's okay. But AsiaSat did drop Radio Free Asia and Voice of America. I mean, those are funded by the US government and broadcast sensitive news into China that the Chinese Communist Party would much rather Chinese people don't know about. Clearly, the greater of two evils. And none of this is new. It's been going on for years. And actually, the US government has known about it. Previous administrations just thought the profits would help American satellite companies reinvest in development, or give the US insight into China's space capabilities, or that China would use these US satellites for benign purposes, such as broadcasting sports. Yes, sports, like target practice. More people in the US government really need to watch China Uncensored. But seriously, according to Boeing, the State and Commerce Departments over 4 administrations, and most recently in 2017, have reviewed and approved export licenses for the AsiaSat satellite constellation to provide commercial bandwidth services to the Asia region, including China. 4 administrations. Thanks, Obama, and Trump, and Bush, and Clinton. Wow, I never thought I'd be able to use them all in the same sentence that way. But again, the problem is that the government only regulates satellite exports, not satellite bandwidth usage. And that's the loophole that's allowed the Chinese Communist Party to use the best American technology to repress Chinese people. There might be some hope, though. When the Wall Street Journal reached out to the Commerce Department for comment, a spokesman said it regularly updates its regulations to counter evolving national security threats, and it considered human rights part of that. And the State Department said it strongly urges companies to implement stringent safeguards to ensure that their commercial activities do not contribute to China's human rights abuses. So maybe this loophole will close, especially if you write to your representatives and tell them what you think. But at the end of the day, the fundamental problem isn't that there's not enough government regulation. It's that private companies like Microsoft, Google, Boeing, Carlyle Group, and SSL put profit above human rights. At least Boeing, in response to questions from the Wall Street Journal, said it has put on hold its latest satellite deal involving China, the one that would bolster the Chinese rival to GPS. So what do you think? Are you depressed too? I recommend French fry covered pizza. Thanks for watching this episode of China Uncensored. And remember, this show is brought to you thanks to support from viewers who contribute through the crowdfunding website Patreon. Visit patreon.com/China Uncensored to learn more. Once again, I'm your host, Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching China Uncensored.